A very good afternoon to all of you, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Victoria Memorial Hall and the Kolkata Partition Museum Trust, it's my honor and pleasure to welcome you all here this evening, going into the evening, for a discussion which promises to be very, very interesting, because that's the way for the future. So the future of museums and memorialization. And our secretary and curator, Mr. Samarendra Kumar, is traveling, so unfortunately he couldn't be present himself here. So he sends us the best wishes for this evening's program. May I request Shagnik Bhattacharya of our education unit and the coordinator of our activity club to kindly take this event forward now.
Thank you, Mr. Raman. Standing at the Victoria Memorial, not the Memorial Hall, the conference hall technically, and talking about memories, I had written a bit of a boisterous speech actually, but decided against it. So let me share a brief memory, allow me the privilege. In my undergraduate days in studying history, not that many years ago, I had the rare fortune or misfortune to be part of a assistant professor recruitment lecture at one of the European universities, where a professor who had fantastic credentials, was a Ugandan of Ugandan origin, was giving a kind of a demonstration lecture. And she showed us a picture which had a pail of water leaking with no end. And there were two questions. Which one of the bucket and the water is history and which one is memory? Is the water memory that is leaking into oblivion protected by the bucket that is history and the ink and paper of the historian, or the ones and zeros of the computer? Or are memories which are colonized, memories which are traumatized, memories which are problematic, really the bucket which hold the history that is leaking under the auspices of colonial historiography together? Unfortunately, that candidate was not chosen for employment because that was not considered academic enough, because she did not prescribe to the Rankian traditions of history writing, where the tangible is all that is important, at least in some universities still. But then I want to ask this question at the onset of this discussion session. Where do museums come in? Where do oral history museums, like the, I think, if I'm not very wrong, the recent most museum initiative in the city right now, the virtual Kolkata Partition Museum, where do they come in preserving that memory and the equation of the bucket and the water? Where do they come in, and how do we walk into the future as part of a memorial that is set in stone, quite literally, and a memorial or a museum that is made of ones and zeros? So please allow me to introduce the initiator of the Kolkata Partition Museum project and the Kolkata Partition Museum Trust, Dr. Rituparna Roy. Dr. Rituparna Roy is initiator of the Kolkata Partition Museum project that aims to establish a partition museum in Kolkata focusing on the Bengal experience. An alumna of Presidency College and Calcutta University, she did her doctoral research in India and her postdoctoral research in Leiden, the Netherlands. She taught at several institutions in Kolkata, Leiden, and The Hague, and she is the author of South Asian partition fiction in English, from Khushwant Singh to Amitav Ghosh, and the co-editor of the ICAS volume, Writing India Anew, Indian English Fiction 2000 to 2010. Roy blogs and writes features and reviews for online portals and magazines. Her maiden collection of short stories, Gariahat Junction, was published in 2020, and she is currently working on a non-fiction book and a co-edited volume of essays on the Bengal partition that will hopefully be out soon from Rutledge. Please welcome Dr. Rituparna Roy. Over to you. Just before we start the proceedings, I would request our accounts officer, Srimati Nivedita Roy Chaudhuri, to kindly felicitate Dr. Roy. And also to felicitate the man behind the ones and zeros of the virtual partition museum, Mr. Orgho Jyoti. A formal introduction to him, he's an architect par excellence, would follow later. So, Madam, would you kindly do the honors? Thank you so much. Over to you, Dr. Roy. just another, sorry, I'm coming back again and again. We have a host of eminent panelists after the presentation by the Partition Museum, which includes, of course, Shumana Chakravarti of the DAG Museums Initiative, Dr. Jayanta Sengupta, director of the Alipur Museum, and Professor Taputi Guho Thakur, the art historian who rarely needs any introduction to probably anybody here. But we'll follow that with, we'll precede that with the discussion here. So yeah, over to you, Dr. Roy.
Good evening, everyone. Dignitaries, friends, colleagues, collaborators, friends, acquaintances, and my fellow panelists. It's a great honor for me to be standing here today and to be invited to speak on Kolkata Partition Museum project, as well as VKPM. I'm going to give you a very brief narrative of our journey so far. So my personal involvement has been for about 7 years now, but the organization that I represent and whose work I'm here to talk about, that is a little younger. So to give you the briefest of outlines about the backstory, I was greatly inspired by the Holocaust Memorials of Berlin in 2016 to start an initiative like this. I first broached the idea at an academic conference in 2017 at Indian Museum, when Jayanta was the director there. In 2018, the trust that steers this project was formed in August of that year. And it's only in 2019 that we actively started working and functioning as an organization. So what have we done in this 4 years? Before saying that, or rather showing that, I just want to take a minute to talk about, you already know what we are about. We want to establish a museum in Kolkata focused on the Bengal partition. But I just want to take a minute to spell out to you our mission and vision. You know, we basically have two main emphases. One is historical specificity, and the other is cultural continuity. So by historical specificity, what I basically mean here is that we want to memorialize the specificity of Bengal's experience of partition, its aftermath and afterlives, in the most comprehensive manner possible. And the other, and equally important for us, we also want to remember the cultural continuities between the two Bengals, which are still there, in fact has always been there, in terms of our common living heritage, which includes, as you all know, language, literature, food, fabric, the performative arts, which is not a small thing. So when it comes to activities, what have we done? I have created a very small video, 30-second video, which constitutes basically event posters. I hope you'll like it. Sorry, can I go back and I just wanted to pause there. The last poster. Anyway, there were 13 posters there. I would know. So 13 events. You could call that in one way. Oh, sorry, yeah. So 13 posters for 13 events. One way of looking at it is our work progressing. And actually, the other feeling I had while looking at it was the years going by, you know. So basically, there was a wide range of programs there, if you have observed. I just want to, since this is a very limited time presentation, I just want to talk a little bit about two salient features of our work as manifested in those events. I'm sorry, actually I wanted to keep it there. It's already here. Anyway, So one is our, our emphasis on the arts, and the other is the role that the pandemic has played, you know, inadvertently almost, you could say, in shaping our work. So some of you here have attended our previous events, so you know that, you already know that we are heavily invested in the arts. We believe in the importance of the arts in preserving cultural memory, which is why a lot of our events, the main ones anyway, have had to do with the arts. So in 2019, we did a 4-day film fest at Jodhanath Bhavan. In 2021, we did an art exhibition at KCC. Last year, when we launched VKPM, it incorporates art and various other kinds of media. Even online events, like we've had online folk concert, a dance program. So this has really been one of our USPs. And we would like to continue in this vein, in fact, build upon it, and probably explore other art forms as well. The other, and perhaps more important for this program at least, is the role that the pandemic has played in shaping our work, as I was just saying. Because as I just mentioned, we actively started working from 2019, and the pandemic hit us, if you remember, in early 2020. So it was just a year into our existence. We were a nascent organization. And we were hard hit by that. Initially, in the sense that we had certain ideas, we had certain programs in mind. They were obviously not worked out yet. But suddenly we had to re-strategize. And it was very frustrating at the beginning because as many as 3 of our events could not happen. An art exhibition, the 2020 art exhibition got pushed to 2021. 2-day workshop could only happen online. And there was also another event slated for May, which we could not finalize at all. So for a fledgling organization, that was really quite a lot. But something very interesting happened. As the pandemic progressed, somehow, somewhere, we got used to online events. And probably got resigned to online events is the better way of putting it. And it's remarkable in how little a time this transition happened, from feeling frustrated that we couldn't have physical events, to kind of accepting that now the online format was the only format that we could work in. And soon enough, we were not only organizing online events of our own, we were also getting invited to others. And it was in one such event that I met Orgho. It was a program organized by the 1947 Partition Archive, in which I was the speaker and he was part of the audience. So he reached out to me after the program with the offer of collaboration between his architecture firm and our trust. And after months of discussions, we decided to go ahead with it. We announced the collaboration early 2021, and soon after, a multidisciplinary 14-member team was formed to start the work. That team gave a very elaborate presentation last year at ICCR, Kolkata, and which garnered quite a bit of media attention, actually. And the one most important thing to tell about the team, unfortunately, it's just Orgo and I here. Shagota was supposed to join. I don't know what happened. Oh, you are here. Okay, there is one more. So the work of the virtual museum happened virtually. We were actually spread across 3 continents, more 2. And though many of us are based in India, but we are based in the different cities of India. So last year, in fact, when we had that program at ICCR, we were about 4 or 5 of us were meeting for the very first time. And I'm so glad, Shakota, that you could make it, because she's also not based in Kolkata now. So the most important thing about the team is that all of them, what is common to them is that they are all very passionate about Bengal partition and have a deep engagement with it, both in life and work. And I'm deeply grateful to them because, or rather we are deeply grateful to them because, this project, in the truest sense of the term, has been a labor of love. And I am grateful because of the, the generousness with which they have shared their time and energy to this project, in addition to having full-time jobs and full-time preoccupations, etc. Um, so Orgo is the architect here, of course, you know, but there were two other architects, an architect turned scenographer and curator, an artist, a historian, of course, and 6 young and very talented research scholars, 2 advisors, one a very well-known art historian, and the other, I'm sorry, I got distracted seeing old friends, and the other a brilliant academic. So where was I? Yes, about the team. I was talking about the team. I will introduce the team to you. Since they are not here, I'm going to introduce the team to you again with a video, another short video, a little longer than the previous one, 1.5 minutes. But before that, I want to talk a little bit about the content of VKPM. So as of now, and I stress the word as of now, because you know, ultimately the virtual museum is a website. And like any website, it is going to grow, it's going to evolve. So the way we initially conceived it, we have 3 main components: events gallery, visual arts gallery, and oral history project. Now, events gallery is the gallery where we are going to tell the story of partition through certain key years and events. The visual art gallery is going to be a gallery that, you know, basically an exhibition of, if I may put it so, politically engaged art in and from Bengal, primarily, from the 40s right up to our times. And the Oral History Project is an independent project that was undertaken specifically for VKPM by these youngsters who conducted interviews on our behalf, and they also shared their own research with us, both. But I must tell you that we have many other features in mind which we are going to add on. We want to give this first, the first 3 components that we've conceived and worked on some time to see how that goes. And I can tell you one thing, that already a few individuals and institutions have approached us to house their archives with us. So we are going to do that as well as the time goes along. So I think it is time now to introduce our team members. I have a fantasy that someday, maybe next year or in the near future, we will actually meet. The entire team will meet one day in person. For now, I'm just happy with Shagota, Orgho, and me. I would like to introduce Orgho formally. And well, the one thing I do know is that he is the brain behind virtual Kolkata Partition Museum. Oh, and one thing I would like to say before giving his CV or rather bio note is that, as I was saying, I'm deeply grateful to each and every member, but none more so than him. He has given, I think, hundreds of man-hours in the last 2 years. So like his passion, his dedication is really without equal. So he's the founder and creative director of OR, the architecture firm which he heads, Architecture Urbanism Research, which has offices both in New York and New Delhi. And just give me a sec. His architectural work creates meaning through social relevance and cultural significance. With a research interest in human migration, he's the chief architect for the Virtual Museum, as we already know by now. Educated as an architect at Harvard, Cornell, and SPA Delhi, he has previously worked for some of the world's leading architecture practices. Shall I say SOM or SOM? SOM? Okay, SOM, OMA, REM Koolhaas, Gary Technologies, and Studio Fuchsas. Over to Orko.
Good evening, everyone. First of all, thank you to Shagnik and the Victoria Memorial Hall for this invitation. Thank you, Rituparnadi, for a wonderful introduction to the project. And thank you, trust members, Taputidi, Jointada, and everyone present today. I would like to Rituparnadi introduced the team and spoke about the background of the trust as well as the project, how it was initiated in discussion started in 2020 but initiated in 2021. So that's the poster showing all the team members. What I would really like to do today is talk about museums, subaltern space, and material memory within the context of the project that we have been working on. And so starting with museum, I think as Shagnik, he wrote a beautiful note, a concept note for this event. And this kind of caters to the concept note that was written, and it is about questioning the role of museums in our contemporary culture and looking at the history, politics, and paradigms behind museums as well. If we look at the root of the word museum, it's a ancient Greek word that goes back all the way to the word museon, and it was about these 9 muses who were responsible for the arts and sciences in Greek. This is a classification of the kind of museums that we have been exposed to in the current world. If we look at ancient history, we realize that museums are started off as a monarchical project, as exhibition of royal collections. And jumping quite a bit, the more prominent evolution of museum became the Cabinet of Curiosities, which was a Renaissance project, an Enlightenment project. These were essentially living room museums in Europe that started out as projects that were done by naturalists as well as adventurers who were traveling. And of course, what we are arguing here is that traditionally the way we know museums is a colonial project. It has always acted as a repository of loot. And how can we transform that colonial project of a museum into a more ethical project? Real quick, in the 20th century, we have seen museums as archaeohistorical project, as living histories, as memorialization project, as the subject of today's discussion is about. And memorialization has always been there, from the Victory Arches of Rome to Paris, but more specifically, post-World War II, the Jewish museums and memorials actually popularized the memorialization project. But what we really want to talk about is how can a museum become an ethical project, which is our understanding for our current project, because we are really focused on the subaltern experience of partition rather than the general experience of partition. So these are some images that I'll quickly scroll through that demonstrates what I just spoke about. This is in Alexandria, Greece, the museum that was the library that it's a place that was started by Ptolemy, but it also served as a place for Plato. So historically very significant. And when I was talking about museums as a monarchical project, this is one of the earliest examples. It's a ruin of a museum in Neo-Babylon that was where the Neo-Babylonians were archiving the memory of the past Mesopotamian civilization. So the curiosity with archiving the old has always been there. This is the beginning of the Cabinet of Curiosity project that started with the project of enlightenment in Europe, also beginning of colonization, where people traveling, naturalists, and adventurers traveling would come back, collect items, and exhibit them in their living room. This is in Italy, a famous example. This is in Germany. This is a Wall Street Journal article from very recently this year in March, where they talk about how the British Museum, a lot of Western museums, they do not have a very clear story behind the transfer of ownership of objects that they have. And recently, a lot of museums in the global south have asked for artifacts being handed back. Quickly moving on to subaltern space. These are images from refugee settlements within Kolkata and outside Kolkata. And I wanted to talk about how the sufferings of the subaltern are protracted and generational, unlike others who are able to salvage their condition. The subalterns remain the perpetual other. In the context of colonization, the natives of the land being colonized are the subalterns. But within the colonized territory, there are long established historical orders and hierarchies embedded within society that create subalterns out of the lowest class and the lowest caste. This is a neighborhood in Dhaka that was left behind, desertion, and eventually reoccupied, new settlements in city suburbs. For us, the oral history project directly addressed the issue of the subaltern, and a lot of these interviews that were collected from very remote regions where the generational suffering of the refugee was clearly demonstrated. These are some of we have collected 22 interviews. Cities are an imprint of migration. These are jute mills outside of Kolkata, some of which lie vacant, some of which are being used. Both voluntary and involuntary, they act as adaptable social structures that absorb journeys and movements. In this story of human migration, what role can a museum play? Can it become the collective memory of the city? Can they tell the story of its evolution? And the last but not the least, the most important thing we want to address is material memory. And over here you see some images from Achal Mehrotra's Material Memory Project. Most of you must be familiar with her work. Very significant work that is not only well written, but it's also visually stunning the way the photographs have been captured. The faculty of memory through its neural synapses is intangible. However, memory flashes tangible physical and material environments as a direct and curated recollection of the past. In this remembrance and curated recreation, materials and material objects play a significant role in the cinematic play of images. Memory is made of materials, and materials have memory. These are materials that make our cities, make architecture, and how they have evolved, and this is a regional study where we were looking at Chandraketugarh to Bakura to contemporary, to colonial buildings, to our post-colonial environment. I'll quickly move on to the design of the museum. So the way we conceptualized the museum, it was a travel through time. Architecture, a predominantly material practice, exists in time as much as in space. The visitor enters concentric worlds of time, represented by truncated, concentric spherical shells with distributed openings acting as thresholds between each layer. Um, so the image on the screen is the outermost shell. When you're in this virtual environment, you are looking at the first layer of the museum, which is made out of earth from different regions in Bengal. And as you progress through the museum, you enter through different layers of material memory, each layer representing a historical time period in Bengal's history. But more importantly, this is a idea, or this is a project that could be applied to other projects, this idea of working with material memory, both for objects but also for materials that constitute our physical environment, that constitute architecture. So that image shows the first layer, which is the one on the left, which is the layer of the earth. Then you have the brick layer. A lot of historical buildings have been abstracted and represented here. And then you have the laterite and the terracotta that represents Bakura and the work that has happened there in those materials. And then gradually, these are very dense spaces. When one is moving through through VR in these spaces, these will be very constricted and compressed. And once you navigate through these layers, as I had shown earlier, you finally enter into a transition space. And this in this transition space, which we call the liminal space, it is for the first time where you can actually see all the layers of history layered behind you, starting from this earth layer to brick to terracotta to laterite to concrete. And this is where you transition into the central space of the museum, which we term archaeologies of memory, where we have fragments of habitation and fragments of transportation that were used by refugees during their migration process. So that's the shell. Once you enter it through the ramp, you enter into this large open space where the portraits of all the oral history interviewees, the refugees, are represented on the wall, and you walk through these mannequins that are in an endless march. At the center of the structure is a reflection pool which reflects. Another thing is, because this is virtual, we are liberated from gravity, we are liberated from economics, so we could do anything and everything. We can float Earth. We can not think about cost. True. The economics of materials, economics of labor remains. So we have these floating cylinders that uses the same sample of earth from different regions in Bengal, from the red earth of Bakura to the earth from Sundarban to different places, and it inverses physical reality in a way where it places the earth at the top, and you see a reflection of the earth on water, along with a reflection of these images of the refugees. That's the website. We're going to make it live in very soon, in a week's time. But the website, as pointed out earlier, will have the oral history project, the partition, the art gallery, and the event gallery. And it will also talk about the sequence of these images, the journey as you go through the structure and the project. And the VR part is being worked on, and in a couple of months, hopefully, we get to finally bring it to a close. And the first link, once you click, it'll take you inside that virtual space. The rest, you scroll through different parts of the project. Hope you enjoyed it and got a good glimpse of what the project is about. And I'm glad to give this presentation in person, and look forward to a great discussion. Thank you.
I am having a sense of loss because I did not look at the virtual KPM yet. So I'm really excited to have an experience. Okay, I did recognize a few people because I translated their accounts, I think. Yeah. So, so now we move into the discussion session. I would briefly introduce the discussants. Professor, huh? No, formally, as is customary. So Professor Tapati Guha Thakurta, who probably needs no introduction, is an historian who has written extensively about the cultural history and the art of India. She was the director and is presently honorary professor in history at the Center for Studies in Social Sciences, Calcutta, and was previously a professor at Presidency College, Kolkata. Okay, Wikipedia is wrong in that case. She finished her DPhil at the University of Oxford, and in 1995 she was the recipient of the Charles Wallace Visiting Fellowship at Wolfson College, Cambridge. In 2011, she was a visiting fellow at the Yale Center for British Art, and in 2018, she was a visiting professor at Brown University. She has written several monographs and curated many art exhibitions across India, and in 2019, she was assigned by the Indian Ministry of Culture to prepare a dossier proposing the inclusion of Durga Puja in the UNESCO representative list of intangible cultural heritage of humanity. So a round of applause for Professor Tapati Guha Thakurta, and I would request Mr. Raman to kindly felicitate her. No, just take the panel. Dr. Jayanta Sengupta is an Indian historian educated at Presidency College, Kolkata and the University of Calcutta. He received his PhD from the University of Cambridge and has taught history for more than 2 decades at Jadavpur University and the University of Notre Dame in the United States before joining the museum profession in 2013. Until January 2023, he served as the secretary and curator of the Victoria Memorial Hall and is currently serving as the director of the nascent Alipur Museum, Kolkata. He is the author of a number of monographs, including At the Margins, Discourses of Development, Democracy and Regionalism in Odisha, and his most recent book, Hishel Darpon, Bangalir Harir Khobor. Mr. Raman, would you kindly do the honors? Dr. Sengupta. And last but definitely not the least, Shumana Chakravarti leads DAG Museums and is working towards a vision of democratizing art by making DAG's vast collection of Indian pre-modern and modern art accessible through museums, museum collaborations, education initiatives, and art programs. A key project of DAG Museums is the development of the Jamini Roy House Museum, followed by the acquisition of the artist's historic home in February 2023 by DAG. She is also the founder of Hamdasti, a Kolkata-based arts platform for socially engaged arts practices. Shumana is a graduate of the Srishti School of Art and Design and Technology at Bangalore and with a master's degree from the Graduate School of Design at Harvard University. She has been a fellow of the Art Think South Asia program at Khoj, Delhi, and at the Global Cultural Leaders program hosted by the European Union. So I'm sure I'm wasting your time speaking here, so over to the panelists and over to Professor Guha Thakurta after Mr. Raman felicitates Ms. Shumana Chakraborty. Over to you, Professor.
Okay. Yeah. It's a pleasure to be here with Jayanto and Shumana, of course also with Rituparna and Orgho, because Jayanto, Shumana and I, through the worst days of COVID, collaborated. The VMH, the DAG, and our center to put up exhibitions and to create a sense of collaboration, which was very important to all of us institutionally and to me personally. So I want to begin by saying I'm really delighted to be here back with the two of you in person. I'm here to moderate, but I'll just begin with a brief set of maybe pointers which could lead the other respondents to speak to. So I have worked with museums, with the history of museums, and I will then very separately sit with Orgho to complicate the history he gave us. But that is not the issue here. I have also been interested in the field of memory and memorialization and the different forms it takes. Now, the panel here today is thinking about museums and memorialization together, which is to say, obviously memorialization can take forms which need not be a museum, and museums are not necessarily memorial sites, though the Victoria Memorial clearly is. But many museums are not specifically designed to be grand monumental sites, carriers of world civilization, but not necessarily memorial sites. So I want to jump a bit into a more recent history, where we know that in the boom of museums, which has affected not just Western countries, but certainly even post-colonial countries like ours, the notion of museum, while the big museums remain major draws for their architecture, for their collection, and not least of all for their crowds, there are alternative museums that are coming up, art museums, history museums, oral history museums. So it is in that space of a new conjunction in thinking about museums as sites of memory and commemoration that I would like to pitch today's discussion and the project that Orgho and Rituparna talked about. So the couple of things I wanted to flag is that we're speaking here of different kinds of transitions, binaries in a way, but also interactions. So let me begin with the physical and the virtual, which is of course the critical one, where the tangibility of objects, the rarity of objects, is replaced by the intangibility often of memory, its fluidity, its continuous restructuring and flow. And so the physical and the virtual here are often together, often working against each other. And Orgho raised the question of material memory, how far memory resides in material and objects, and how far objects themselves carry deep layers of memory with them. So that to me is a very important point of, does one replace the other? Does putting up a virtual museum or having an online presence, we know that most museums today have very major online presence for their exhibitions and all, which never really does away with the appeal. The idea is to reach out to larger publics, but equally to strengthen the draw of the exhibition or a particular room there. So that is where, so just as memories and objects, intangibility and tangibility remain closely entangled, so does the physical space, architecture, structure of the museum with a new virtual presence that they've all taken on. The other would be the public-private, and I think that is very important because museums have always been public repositories. Even private museums, private art museums are not wanting to become major public repositories. In this space then, especially when we think of a different order of memory, collective memory, memories of trauma, displacement, subaltern memories that Orgho and the VKPM has prioritized, there is a passage from the private to the public, which cannot be an easy passage. So we know that much of the trauma of partition remained deeply embedded. Partition studies was a late arrival. Historians were late in trying to think about it. Cinema artists, filmmakers, artists, certainly authors were able to express somewhere the interiority of that trauma and displacement evaded objective history writing. And this has been a huge issue. There are, of course, scholars like Joya Chatterjee and others who wrote, but it was always partisan histories, right? Because those histories would have to look at states and roles. So when one turned to people's histories and their traumas, the creative arts were at the forefront, and then the oral historians. I'm thinking of Urvashi Butalia's Other Side of Silence, a landmark book, Ritu Bhasin's book, the partitioning of memory. So I think over the 2 decades, this idea of how much we can draw into the public without violating, people may want to forget, people may want to remember, is an issue. So this public-private transaction, especially where partition is concerned, because the idea of commemoration is to have a public commemorative, collective commemorative space where across classes, across castes too, across maybe different dialects and regions of the 2 Bengals, there will be a common site for collaboration, and whether physical or virtual, it will be a public site. So that again is something we need to think, because so much of private donations come into museums to acquire a public life. Will memories acquire the same status when they come from the private into a public domain of things? The other is audience and public, where popular versus elite, which is something that museums often talk about. One of the reasons for the reinvention of museums in recent times is that they were in some sense elitist institutions, but they were always very widely visited. So the cultural education of a middle class was very centrally premised on museum going, and even more so now. There have been major factors. Now, if that is so, then there's a very interesting now dichotomy that these alternative forms of museums are often niche ventures. Very often it's a community museum, where it could be, I'm reminded of the Kochi Biennale, where fishermen put up an installation of all those who were absent fishermen, where the artisan or the subaltern becomes a participant in that. It is happening here too, in terms of their willingness to speak, to be photographed, to be part of this. So, but by and large, it is the large monumental museum that has remained, and which other museum than the one we are in, right? They are the people who draw the maximum crowds. And there's been a big debate in museum studies between informed, uninformed publics, initiated versus uninitiated. And the real bane of Indian museums has always been to say that numbers are there, but not quality. Quantity does not make up for quality of viewing. And that has been the debate on what kind of museum education we generate. So for the Virtual Partition Museum Trust, the question would be, how far can we draw a public and the people who are the subjects of a lot of the oral history? How accessible, how easy? I mean, I was so touched by the detail with which Orgho took us through terracotta, through brick, through earth, through cement, through steel. And I felt deprived saying, I'll only see it on a screen, right? I will never be able to feel the tactility of that material. The other is the question of accessibility and intimacy. Much of memory thrives in small, intimate spaces of conversation, often with a known community, right? Not outsiders. So all of these are questions I want to place before those who are, working. And I think I've taken up too much time already. But so somewhere I hope that the virtual museum will also work somewhere with material memories and collectivities of a different kind. And I'll end with just one example. We all know about the Partition Museum in Amritsar, but there's a more recent museum that some of you may know about, which has just come up, May 2023, which is the transformation of the Darashikoh Library in Old Delhi near the Kashmiri Gate into a Delhi-based partition museum. I got to know about it. It's very new. There was an article I read about it, which is going to come out in the Critical Collective, and where they talked a bit about structure, not dissimilar from the Partition Museum, but in a way not dissimilar from this too, because there's an oral history component, there's artworks, major artworks by Veer Munshi, which are mediating your passage. There are photographs, archival documents, all of that. And the Whether good or bad, how can we say? We haven't been there. I don't know if anybody here has seen it, but it's the space. It's the Darashiko Library which got me thinking, a place with such a rich history that takes you from the 17th century through the mutiny into being the Delhi College, the precursor of Delhi University, the Archaeological Survey Office, Ambedkar University, and now the Partition Museum. So think of the layered histories of the space itself. So here is just a throwing open a suggestion that maybe we should not give up the idea of an actual museum. We don't. I'm not saying this. So while I'm fully endorsing this amazing effort, and truly amazing, I mean, I still, maybe because I'm old-fashioned and I belong to a different generation, and I worked so much with physical spaces of museums, objects, curators, publics, how you should behave, how you should not behave, that somewhere this very futuristic virtual space leaves me thinking about for whom, how accessible, how easily will we be able to negotiate this. Now, Jointo. Respondent rather than a pure moderator.
Thank you so much, Tapotidi, and good evening to all of you. And it's a privilege to be here, to be back here, actually, and be part of this discussion. And I mean, there are so many big questions that have come up during the initial presentations by Rituparna and Orgho, and then, of course, Tapotidi's, this whole summing up of some of the critical issues in the museum field. Now, of course, one of the things that comes to my mind is that this is a major museum, Victoria Memorial Hall, and it's like the other big players, like the Indian Museum or the National Museum in Delhi, or the Salarjung, and so on. These government, big museums. In a sense, and this has been pointed out in the concept note, that this is a time, especially now, this is a time when the role of the so-called universal museums or big encyclopedic museums is coming under increasing scrutiny, and for good reason, because there are categories you saw in Orgho's presentation, like the colonial project, the colonizing project, in which we had some of the great encyclopedic museums of mainly the 18th century, the British Museum and the Louvre, the Hermitage. They are all, to a greater or a slightly lesser extent, they are part of, they're products of empire, products of expansion, imperial expansion of Europe. And which directly connects to the question of restitution of cultural property, which also Orgho mentioned briefly. But it's a fact that if we had a perfect application of the principle of the restitution of cultural property, then the great museums of the West would be substantially empty. And I'm not sure whether that is the way, that's the road that we must take. There is also the other paradigm of the Metropolitan Museum in New York, which shows the power of the dollar, the purchasing power of the American economy, although which is in its own way connected with expansion or expansionism. Now, in India, the sort of, and Tapotidi has written about this in her major book on monuments, objects, histories, that the Indian approximations of these encyclopedic museums, like the National Museum or the Indian Museum. The Indian Museum is the original paradigm. They're not quite universal museums because they were products of the colonial context, and they were products of the early products of sort of British or European imagination of India as a land of curiosities. Now, what has happened now in the recent years is that, and having worked in a big museum for nearly a decade, I have been part of these conversations, especially within the government, about making the big museums even bigger, the creating a larger impact, redeveloping them as cultural spaces and all that. But in my limited experience, the small museums, which I have seen, many of the small museums, and this is because of my training as a historian, I have always wondered, even as somebody working in a big museum, about who really speaks for our many pasts, our plural pasts, because we don't have one past. The universal museum paradigm is sort of, in a sense, trapped in singular narratives. Not quite, but primarily one narrative, often homogenized by the state, by the nation state. But I have always thought that our diversity, our many pasts, far more representative or far more capable of speaking about our many past are these small museums. Like, and I'm not quite sure, the Partition Museum in Amritsar is not a small museum per se, but it captures incompletely the voices of the victims of the partition in the Punjab. Or smaller museums like the Desert Museum in Rajasthan called Orna Jharna, which is a museum on brooms, which uses brooms as a metaphor for life in the austere life in the desert. Or a museum which I have not seen but I have read quite a bit about is the Remember Bhopal Museum, which is a museum in Bhopal on the memories of the Bhopal gas tragedy of 1984, which is one of the rarest museums in India on a movement for justice, a social movement for justice. And it's completely devoid of, they have never wanted any government support. And it is a museum that is a small museum that tries to capture the voices of the small through material memory and also through intangible remembrance and memories and so on and so forth. So, and I think there's a similarity between, for example, a museum on partition and, in a sense, the objects of any museum, because like those who experience partition and displacement and homelessness, museum objects are also, in a sense, homeless. They have been, by some historical forces, they have been placed out of their homes, out of their context, and the museums try to recontextualize them to give them a new home. Now, the possibilities of the Kolkata Partition Museum, or like other smaller initiatives, is that there are two kinds of memories related to the partition. One thing is very sure, and this has always been in our minds, is that, and Tapotidi talked about this, is that the historiography of the partition of India, I'm not saying Bengal per se, but of India, has changed quite a bit in the 21st century. Because when I was, for instance, a student in school or college, or even Tapotidi was in school, then the historiography of the partition revolved around causation theories. Who was responsible? Which party? Which statesman was responsible? And so on and so forth. But since, broadly speaking, and as has already been said, the human side of the partition was not really taken up by historians as such, much more so by artists, filmmakers, playwrights, and all that. But more or less since the partition, since the publication of Urvashi Bhutalia's book, The Other Side of Silence, the historiography has shifted on the human side of the the human experience of the partition. And it's quite interesting. And it's sort of, I think, the inspiration that Bhutalia's book and Vasin's book, they have provided is that they then got people to speak and write more and more on partition. And it's very interesting because many of you, I'm sure, have read Bhutalia's book, and she has interviewed people across the border in Pakistan as well as in India. And it's so instructive and interesting that if you don't read the short bio note of the interviews, then you will not be able to figure out whether this person is from India or Pakistan, which talks about the universality of the human suffering in the partition. So to talk about this more, to turn these memories and to bring them out through various kinds of explorations and documentation and archiving and memorialization, it's in a sense an effort towards some kind of a reconciliation of a traumatic event. Not a closure, but some kind of reconciliation. Now, of course, there are memories. There are memories of people who have gone through the partition, or who have, even I, who has not seen partition, of course, even my father's generation, they haven't seen partition because my family came from East Bengal, but they were not partition refugees. They migrated to Western, the part of Bengal in the 1930s. But I also carry, many of my generation carries some kind of a constructed, crafted nostalgia of sorts, which is something like a post memory, which is our legacy. Now, there are memories and there are material memories, which has been documented so brilliantly in Anshul Malhotra's book and many others. Now, ideally, we have built a virtual KPM. Orgho has designed it, and the team led by Rituparna and Orgho have worked towards this. What the virtual KPM does is that it also deals on both material memory, various objects belonging to people who have had experienced partition at first hand, and also the remembrances, the memories. Now, as has just been said, we have not given up the hope of building a real museum in which you will be able to see these objects of material memory and to touch them and to relate to them. But of course, the main problem is space. It's a small museum. We are trying through this museum, and we have taken the virtual mode to transcend these difficulties of space and resources. And as Orgho said, it's not cheap to make, but it is, of course, it dispenses with the enormous expenses of building a site-specific museum with a real collection and so on and so forth. So this is just a beginning, and it's there has been interesting and very important new efforts in making such museums on memories. Anshul Malhotra has this project called the Museum of Material Memory. There is also this curator called Anusha Yadav, who has created something called the Indian Memory Project, which is also similar to Anshul Malhotra's, but I mean it's a collection of memories and remembrances, because this is how, through the documentation and archiving and museumization of these remembrances, we forge new connections with the past and try some kind of a reconciliation with the present. So the virtual medium is something that is easier to make, that dispenses with many of the actual problems of logistics. It is technically accessible to anyone all over the world. But as Taputidi raised this question, which I think is the most important question, that which is like the real subaltern subjects of the partition. Is it accessible to them? Can it be? Can the subalterns see their, a museum made on their memories? This is an important question which we will have to grapple with in the near future. I don't know how, but we will definitely try to find some way. That's all I can say for now. But then we can have more discussion as we go along. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Tapudidi, for setting the tone of the discussion, and Joyantada. Of course, a very tough act to follow after you two, but hopefully I can add something to this discussion and in terms of my own conundrums with the work that we're doing. But I'd like to start by sort of remembering my first class during my master's. Orgo and I actually joined college together in our master's, but one of my first classes was with an artist who's the head of our department, called Krzysztof Wodiczko. He was a Polish artist who worked in the 60s and 70s and started one of the kind of, grand old artists of public art and public space practice. And he would be into something called projection bombing, where you're sort of overlaying monuments and memorials with projections. So he really was very passionate about this idea that, how do we prevent memorials from creating a sort of closure or creating a sort of resolution that ends the narrative and sort of packs it up in a nice neat box and makes it like it's something of the past. So one of his very striking projects was that he would work with the sort of statues of unnamed soldiers which are littered across the landscape. And that was during the Afghan and Iraq wars, and he would record veterans and their testimonies in the present, especially of their trauma, of their, the phantom limbs, the memories that remain, and projected in these public squares onto these memorials and reanimate them. That really sort of, made me think about the idea of memorials and how one can continue to reanimate them, continue to connect them to the contemporary. I think I really relate to this idea of the many pasts as well, but also then how does the past come in conversation with the present, and how does a museum like the VKP, so sorry, should have practiced that before. But how does a museum like the Kolkata Partition Museum then continue to engage with the conundrums of today, the myths that remain, the false assumptions, the biases, the stereotypes, and how do we, bring the past in dialogue with the present? Jonathan, you were talking about your own memories, but even as a third generation of me listening to my grandmother, or actually a story of my father who grew up in Jamshedpur, and he used to always tell me, my friend Asadullah, he watched his parents being killed in front of his eyes while he was lying under his bed. And for a long time, this remained a family memory till very recently when I said, Baba, 1960s ki chilo, mane ki violence chilo. Going back to, say, the 1961 movement of refugees across the border, and then subsequently in the 70s. So I think that reanimation of these histories of movements and partitions, and how it interacts with our own contemporary imagination. I'm not just talking about the bigots and the people who, I'm not just talking about the bigots, but people like us who have maybe memorialized it or mythologized it in our minds in different ways, but opening up these granularities might reveal more to us about our current disposition or about the problems that we are facing today. So that's why I brought up Professor Wodiczko's project, because it really helped do that. It helped bring the past in a direct conflict and sort of, conjunction with the present. And that's what I wonder about memorials, and how can memorials continue to do that. In fact, one of the things that he made us read was about the Holocaust in Berlin, and how there was this idea that perhaps there was a competition for a Holocaust memorial, but some of the artists submitted proposals that what if the competition never ended? What if we kept getting proposals? The memorial itself was the proposal. The memorial itself was this constant rechurning and re-engaging with this idea of what could a memorial be, instead of then sort of entering an aestheticized, perhaps sanitized, perhaps elite space, which then sort of neatly sort of sensitively, visually encapsulates that experience and delivers it to you. That also brings me to this idea of the room for interpretation. Like, how do, when we juxtapose material and memory, or the past and the present, or objects of partition and narratives of partition, how can museums in these sort of juxtapositions create space for interpretation? Which is what I think I really worry about museums today, especially the kind of memorials like the Bhuj Memorial, the Pradhan Mantri Memorial, which are pure tech museums, and very proudly so pure tech museums, So when these juxtapositions are not happening and a narrative is being neatly laid out for you in a virtual space or using digital technology, digital interfaces in a museum, how do these interpretations and juxtapositions and remakings of meanings and new connections emerge if we lay it out so linearly and so clearly for people to, just take the message that we want, consume the message we want to give them? I think that's the challenge with this bringing together of what Tapatiti was talking about, the digital and the physical, and when the physical and the digital meet in these strange ways. They can meet in a wonderful way, like Professor Wodichko's project, when the digital is animating and sort of violently, somewhat, strongly criticizing this static memorial. But in some ways, they can also just lay out these neat packaged linear narratives for us to consume without further criticality, further reinvention, further investigation and interrogation. So I think that's something that I think about when we're thinking about memorials. Conflictorium is a good example for me. Dr. Sengupta laid out some wonderful examples, but the Conflictorium in Ahmedabad by Avni Sethi is a wonderful example of that, where a museum exists, where it's a museum of conflict, and where it exists to grapple with issues of the past through the lens of the present, and has a very strong exhibition, education program, rotating calendar of exhibitions, creating a safe space for artists who don't have space elsewhere. So it takes on a somewhat activist role in that sense in the context of Ahmedabad. So that's an example that I think I've actually never visited, but yes, it does. It has a memory tree as well there. And then it has a room about the Constitution. But again, the exhibits keep changing. The location of the museum, again, is in a neighborhood, which is across the river and, difficult to get to. But somehow, bravely, they carry on with this project. And again, they don't limit it. Again, it's not a linear narrative of we're in Ahmedabad. They bring artists from across India, from Kashmir, from the Northeast, from other zones of conflict, and to create a safe haven for these artists. So it takes on this role as well, where it really is quite brave and bold in what it does. And I think that level of bravery is also needed, especially to counter the other narratives that the larger museums in our country can move towards. And specifically in a less sort of politically charged context of the Jamni Roy Museum, here is a sweet old man, and obviously very familiar, and artist we all love. But I do think about that we're celebrating this gentleman, we're celebrating somebody who's known as the people's artist. But how do we not sort of make it a kind of memorial, an uncritical memorial to him, or how do we sort of layer his narrative in ways that makes him unfamiliar to us and to a contemporary audience, who's only seen his works either in museums or on bus stops and every building in Kolkata? How do we open up the many narratives and layers of this man and his practice? And perhaps for me, the answer that I'm now struggling with as we're thinking about the curation and the research behind it is there's an idea of the people's artist. What does it mean to be a people's artist? Was he a people's artist or not? And perhaps that could be one thread that we build our project around. But yes, again, it makes me somewhat uncomfortable in some ways, excited about this museum, but also in some ways uncomfortable that what if we, freeze this man in time and, create this kind of, this memorial that celebrates him just as we know, without opening up any new connections and juxtapositions. So I think that's a challenging task, less maybe with Jamni Roy, more so with the partition, but it's a wonderful challenge to take on for sure.
I was wondering whether Rituparna and Orgo, or any one of you would like to respond to any of the things we've raised, and then we will open it up to the floor. If you want to, or we can start taking questions straight away. And I would say it would be good if both of you could join us, because the questions would also be to you all, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to emphasize that probably this is something I should have said first, is that the virtual museum is part of the greater project. Kolkata Partition Museum is the rubric under which it is happening. As I said that, I'll stand, I can't sit and talk. So as I said that, you know, Orko's proposal came at a time when it was like manna from heaven. Because during the pandemic, we were wondering how to take this work forward. And this was a wonderful solution to that. That how do we use this time? And in 2020, we did not know how long it will be, you know. But the aim, the desire for a physical museum is there, and this is actually a step towards it. Not either or, this is not binary. So just wanted to reassure you of that. And of course, there is the space and money. These are, you know, these are two most important things for any project. But just as when I first broached this idea in 2017, there were many who were not even ready to entertain this idea. They thought that it was just not possible. But we have done something of it in the last few years, and through the pandemic at that. So I am extremely, as Shumana was saying, courageous and brave. I mean, no project of this kind can happen without a bit of crankiness, craziness, you know, being courageous and being brave. And I take tremendous heart from the fact that in the last 5 years, 4 years, you know, the events, I just showed you the posters, which were just markers of those events. So many people have come forward to make our work possible. So that itself shows that, I mean, all these years, the first response of any person who hears about this project is that, oh, finally it's happening, it should have happened long ago. And the very fact that so many people have always come forward without hesitation, with a lot of generosity. Once the VKPM is in place, of course, we will be in a better position to probably pitch for big money. We are hoping that. But it will also open up other opportunities. And all the things that all three of you said, you know, it is, Taupati, I was really touched by what you said about accessibility. Because, you know, we are keeping it free. So when it goes live, you won't believe it took us almost a year to, like, one of the things that is delaying the process a bit, because we were over-ambitious. We thought we'll finish the work of creating the content and design and the website, everything last August. It was like too ambitious of us because we didn't realize the nature of the project. Every single detail, every single resource used in the content needs permission. So while the content is there, it cannot be put up unless the requisite permissions are coming, and that takes a lot of time.
Thank you, Rituparnadi. Taupati, the wonderful introduction. I really like the way you framed it. Joined to us, the same, Shumana. I would like to say that responding to whatever you said is the sensorial in a museum is super important, and most museums are about giving us information. You have an artifact, they give you information. There's information overload. Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Louvre, you can take a week to see that museum. There's so much information. But I would like to share a very small initiative in New York Armory. Ai Weiwei, the Chinese artist, he had created a show about surveillance, how nation states are creating states of surveillance. And he collaborated with architects Jacques Herzog and Pierre de Meuron, Swiss architects. So what they did was they emptied the hall of the armory, and you entered the armory and it was completely pitch black. You spent half an hour walking through that darkness, and then there are these drones and cameras that are taking X-ray visions of you while you're walking through. Very spooky. while you're walking through that space, and you're pretty scared, but at the same time, with the little light that is there in the room, you're able to engage with the drones, with the surveillance devices, and you start playing with them. And after half an hour or an hour of remaining in that darkness, you come out, and once you come out, your face gets recognized, and you're flashed with all the images of you inside that dark space. And it's really something very simple, but it's not about how nation states are creating states of surveillance. There's no example. It's about you actually experiencing it, your senses being one with that space and understanding a phenomenon. And I think that is important. And very, very few museums are able to do that. And maybe we don't need information in museums. Maybe we need to, museums need to engage with our senses more rather than giving us, information. But I don't know if it was a response, but maybe definitely a reaction to what all three of you said.
Really is a very small question. I principally work a lot with children's stories and young adults, and I was thinking of the next generation. Do you have a plan, perhaps not immediately, but do you have a plan to have some kind of a trail or experiential route for children and young adults globally? Because today, I think today's Bengalis, we're all over the world, not necessarily conversant with the mother tongue. There may be so many other issues to look at, but fundamentally a space that children can navigate through. And I don't just mean children of privileged backgrounds. I do mean experientially a broad enough thing. So Tapati, one of the things I did feel is the phone actually I find is a great equalizer. So I'm actually quite excited. I'm just waiting to see what you would do with it to make it accessible to everybody. But I think the phone is a great equalizer.
Can we just take the questions together and then have people answer them? Okay, so yes, please.
I'll try to keep this really short. You have got a tab on subaltern memories, but have you thought of developing something on the experience of the middle classes? Because, theirs was a different experience, no doubt, but there is trauma there, but there is also very often, as you said, humanity. And because I come from a family and have married into a family both with roots in East Bengal, and in family lore there are so many stories which is humor, humanity, and of course trauma. And I think if you listen to some of those stories, the binaries between along communal lines as well as East Bengal and West Bengal, that also I think get a little more complicated.
Now about Germany, yes, you're right that they do take children there, and there is a foundation that is doing a wonderful job there, which is called Erinnerung, Verantwortung, Zukunft, which stands for memories, responsibility, and future. So it binds these three to say that taking these memories to the future generations is our responsibility, and that is how this foundation is working. And through that, it's making it easier for this passing on of these experiences in a different way.
Yeah, so Joshudhara, you will be happy to know that yes, there are many ideas. Kilbil korche bhetore amader. But you just a week from now or 6 days from now, we are going to have an online discussion on writing history for children. There is the series Itihashe Hate Kori. The 3 books have been out last year. 3 more is in the offing. We wanted to actually do that last year. It didn't happen. One of my favorite bits in the virtual museum is in the virtual art gallery. There is a section, so there is the 3 subsections as modernists, contemporaries, and chotoder border. You might, it sounds weird. and yeah, children's response to the border. There was this book a couple of years ago written by someone called Munjira Shaha called Chotoder Border. We did a special Children's Day program on that. It is a book by children, not on children. It is a collation of drawings and writings by school children about their experience of the border. It's just one school in a border district, classes 5 to 12. It's a delightful book, and I will especially urge you to read that. So the thing is, what we have done, along with Shomnath Hor and Zainul Abidin and others, we actually have a subsection which makes their drawings a part of the gallery. So, you know, we have already given acknowledgement and respect to their experience. And we want to, obviously, children are there in our minds, and what you suggested is something we will keep in our minds and work on it, for sure. The question about, what was that question? I'm forgetting. What was it that you asked? Yes. Right. I think, you know, children have a maturity that we underestimate. I have a 11-year-old child, and partly because of the work I do, she has already, you know, she already knows a lot about it. And though we do not come from a kind of partition-affected family, though both my parents' families were originally, they hailed from East Bengal, but both the families came over to the other side much before partition. So we really don't have a partition story to say. But I think, you know, children, I'll give a little, probably an irrelevant example, just to emphasize the point that we can introduce children to any history if we want to, if we just make it interesting. So I had lived in Netherlands for a long time, and I remember they have two maritime museums, you know, one in Amsterdam and one in Rotterdam. I'd been to the Rotterdam one, and I remember it was a weekday, and in one of the huge halls, which tell about their maritime history, there were a lot of models of ships, you know, down the centuries. And I saw school children splayed out on the floor, doing drawings of those ships, whichever ship they liked. So, you know, it was a wonderful way, I think, of getting introduced to that history. Okay, that is a history that they are proud of, and we know what that history was about. We know what empire was about, right? And obviously that's a biased history probably they are learning, but at least, you know, I think drawing, which is incorporated in every subject at the primary level, that's a wonderful way of introducing them to history. So I think even traumatic histories, in fact, a number of books have been written now. There have been graphic novels. After COVID, I'm forgetting everything. I'm sorry, apologies for that. But there was this one particular graphic novel. Yes, no, not just this side, that side. There was another character, a small boy character. There was a graphic novel a couple of years back, which was very popular. So this is already happening, you know, and I think children can be introduced to anything, for that matter.
Somehow. Tapati, with your permission, I just want to make a closing remark, and then you can officially close the session. Is that I would like to zoom out, really zoom out, and not talk about partition, but talk about the city as a whole. And it really pains me to see that a lot of people internationally do not know Calcutta. They don't know. They know about Delhi, people who know about India, they know about Delhi, they know about Bombay, Mumbai, but they don't know Calcutta. And the very few people who know about Calcutta, they know about it as a city of slums. So, definitely, so I'm coming to that. What I mean to say is that having these museums, a city has multiple histories. So even if we are able to address these histories through small museums, as Joyantada said, a proper museum about indenture, the Indian diaspora across the world started from here, right? Partition is a very important subject, indenture, all these. And that way, if we are able to highlight those histories and bring Kolkata on the global map through its local indigenous histories and undo some of the wrongs that Mother Teresa has done, bless her soul, she's done amazing work, but the brand image of the city has been destroyed forever, and that cannot be, and that white man savior that Dominic Lapierre's book. So how can we undo that? And this is not completely unrelated to the subject, but through initiatives like this, we can bring Calcutta on the global table. Otherwise, we will not. We will never be able to do it through economics of New York City or London, right? We'll have to do through the multiple histories that the city has and portray it at a contemporary global culture. So,
Okay. Just quickly, I was upset that it's Mother Teresa. I don't think we can take Dominique Lapierre and Mother Teresa on the same terms. Yes, there was a negative picture entirely. I just want to end with, and they migrated. So actually, I do feel it is a story that is there in different layers, but I do feel that, say, a Dandakarunno history takes us into Chhattisgarh, right? So a Bihar question, a UP question, I think we cannot any longer say, yes, people may not know about Calcutta, people may not know that partition also happened in the East, but the truth is that our generation and the next and for generations, the reality will lie in our nationhood, in our citizenship problems, in the religions we hold. So that history is crucial. There's no erasing that history. So I do believe that it's an Indian history. It is not, it's a South Asian history. It is not of Punjab and Bengal, though these two regions felt the impact of the migration the most. On that note, I'd like to thank Rituparna and Orghojyoti for opening up this huge area for discussion, for your presentations, to Jayanto and Shumana, for bringing in their inputs as people from the head of museums, and to all of you for being such an engaged audience and keeping us here for a full 2 hours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tapati.
Thank you so much.
I would also like to thank the Secretary and Curator of Victoria Memorial Hall, Sri Samarendra Kumar, and all our staff, including caretaker and electrical, sound, cameraman. I'll end this program here.